Welcome to London's New York. To begin this episode, Dan and I went to a place a lot of tourists might not think to visit when they come to Brooklyn. Greenwood Cemetery, just south of Prospect Park. It's enormous, and like everywhere in New York, it's a monument to a kind of close communal existence. Strangers from all backgrounds pushed up next to each other in eternity, just like they were in life.
I love this. Vitali and Ryerson with their crosses and angels, and then behind is Zheng with Chinese characters.
Solomon, Rota, Zheng, March.
Botchko.
These are some pretty recent ones, and they're living together in Komati.
We came here, though, to visit one grave in particular, the final resting place of one of the most famous and quintessential New Yorkers, the great conductor and composer, Leonard Bernstein.
Glad she has some stones, too. Wow. Well, we don't really have a cemetery in Paris where we have Jim Morrison and Oscar Wilde in this, and where there's all these traditions around leaving things on the tomb. In the Jewish tradition, you leave stones, but I'm very happy to see people have left guitar picks with Leonard Bernstein over here. The writer of what I think is New York's secular Talmud, West Side Story. For New Yorkers, I think of a certain generation born in the 30s or 40s. This was the great promise of American life and of city life, New York in particular, of a place where differences could be potentially reconciled. And in every single way, the musical is about reconciliation. It's not only about between races, whites and Puerto Ricans, or reconciliation between Shakespeare and modern prose, Shakespeare and slang, reconciliation between jazz, popular music, and Broadway, and in fact classical music, because of course Bernstein started in classical music. Reconciliation between the worlds of art, theater, and music, choreography. This was really this kind of melting pot of a musical, and for me, to insult that musical is like insulting America, basically, or at least the vision of what America could be,
or at least New York.
Was it a promise that was never realized? Was it a promise that was realized once and we need to go back to? Or as Bruce Springsteen sings, is something a lie when it doesn't come true, or is it something worse, right? Or was it just our self-deceptions to begin with? And West Side Story, it has such a deep hold on Jewish liberals, I think, and on liberals more generally. And you compare it to Hamilton, and where people are doing the exact same things. I guarantee you the same people who love West Side Story are the same people who adore Hamilton now. Maybe they might have quibbles with the style of music, but that same sort of thing where it's an instrument of reconciliation between hip-hop and musical theater, between the black experience and the white experience, between history and today. It still has that promise of understanding built into it. I'm glad that there's something so cogent, so well put together, that liberals can point at and say, this is what I stand for. And, for me, that is sort of what I stand for. And it is sort of the scripture that I'll challenge, that I'll chafe against, I'll rub against, but I always do so from a background of there's more right than wrong with this vision. I think the promise of it, especially in that song Somewhere, it still moves my mom's to tears every time she hears it. I'm sure many other people, this idea that there's a place for us. Though it's interesting, this part of the lyrics are peace and quiet and open air. That's not what you're going to find in New York. You're going to find that in the suburbs or the cemetery. So maybe we could think Maria and Tony did wind up finding peace and quiet and open air if they're buried together in Greenwood, perhaps.
Let's listen to a little bit of that song. Here's a 2001 recording by the Nashville Symphony Orchestra with Betsy Morrison singing the role of Maria.
There's a place for us, somewhere a place for us, peace and quiet and open air, wait for us somewhere. There's a time for us, someday a time.
So Bernstein.
Right. I invoke his name and spirit.
So let's talk about that
Yeah.
cosmopolitan paradigm, because it'd be hard to think of a better icon of that than Bernstein, right?
Yes.
And I know he's really, a personal hero of yours and somebody you really admire, that he's both a keeper of this European classical tradition and also a pioneer of Broadway and these, popular forms and he was an intellectual and a socialite and he's even bisexual. He's so everything that he's everything,
Yeah. I mean, he, in so many ways, is an exemplar of being able to form bridges between communities or paradigms that seem like they're endlessly conflicting. Classical music and Broadway, the old world and the new world, Jewish culture and other cultures. There's a sort of message of tolerance there, that differences can be reconciled somewhat smoothly with enough empathy. The route forward is empathy, putting yourself in another person's shoes. So to contextualize Leonard Bernstein's activities, New York City at this time is still in a kind of post-war glow of affluence and redevelopment, at least for certain people. There's urban renewal happening. There's a huge public housing program. Highways are being built. There's the gigantic new Lincoln Center is being constructed during the mid-1950s. And Bernstein is able to tap into this sort of post-war energy and funding in a way that few conductors or composers have before. He's being enriched through state munificence to the arts, through private philanthropies, many of them sort of enriched by Jewish donors. And he's able to promote this new sort of modern, prestigious New York, not just in the city and the country, but on these amazing global tours. He goes out to Eastern Europe and Russia, where he's adored by many people coming over there. But at the same time, West Side Story is in response to very pressing domestic issues around race, around juvenile, quote, delinquency, around the still existing and spreading issues of the quote, slums of inner city life. I mean, it was still somewhat radical to do. And at the same time, he's teaching like no one has ever taught before. Yeah, this is where I think it all comes together in a sense.
With his work as a teacher.
With his work as a teacher, I think. Teaching was fundamentally at the core of his being. And the way you can get at this is look at the omnibus documentaries that he did in the mid-50s and look at the series on musical education for young people that he did through Lincoln Center. These recordings are online. And he's able to, in precise, evocative, elegant language, describe how music works and the emotional and political and aesthetic dimensions of it. I mean, I'll never forget, like, the very first young person's guide to music that he does, he says, what is music? Is it just individual notes? No. If you just played one note on a keyboard and left it at that, that's not music. But when you play two notes, a note that's low and then a note that's high, or vice versa, it's the relation between those notes that music is.
You see, notes aren't like words at all. Because if I say one single word all by itself to you, like rocket, immediately you have an idea. You see a picture in your mind. Rocket, bang, picture. But if I play a note, one note all alone, that means nothing. It's just a plain old F sharp or a B flat, a sound, that's all. Higher or lower, louder or softer. A sound
was
that can seem
able
very
to
different if I
convey
play
in
it,
his teaching this
or if
real.
I sing it, or if an oboe
I mean,
plays it.
it's not enough. You know, it sounds facile when I say it's joy, but I'm going to just get a quote from him that conveys this. So here's what he says. I can do things in the performance of music that if I did on an ordinary street would land me in jail. I can get rid of all kinds of tensions and hostilities. By the time I come to the end of Beethoven's Fifth, I'm a new man. And when we relate this to liberalism, the idea of liberalism in this sort of social version is that people can grow, people can change through communication by being exposed to new ideas. And Bernstein believes this can happen through music and art, and the joy that he gets from teaching in so many ways, and I think you get this when you're a teacher, is when you're seeing people changed through the music, through the lessons you're conveying. And he has this faith in both art being able to do this and also politics being able to do this. I mean, you know, we're going to get more into his politics maybe in a bit, but Bernstein, there are 4 volumes of CIA dossier files on Bernstein from all the communist front sort of organizations he was involved in the 40s and 50s, not even talking about the 60s yet. So he isn't one of these, you know, only art can save us romantics, let's say, but he also wasn't one of these technocratic only policy and policy wonks can save us. He really felt you could do both. You know, where is that kind of liberalism today, where we have people who have a very precise notion of cultural change that can save us, and at the same time are involved in social movement justice? An example I'd like to think is Lin-Manuel Miranda. We'll talk more about that later. But one of the things I like about Bernstein is his commitment to his belief that both art and politics can save us, and has this wonderful audience with which to do that. For a moment, a person like him could be on CBS and dispense this lesson to everyone.
We'll be right back after these messages. If you're enjoying this show, you might also like some of the other podcasts on Race Car Radio. For instance, you might try Mind Your Own Business with Mike and Matt. Do you own or run your own company? I'm a small business owner, and let me tell you, it's a lot harder than I thought it would be. But never fear, we're here to help. On Mind Your Own Business, Mike Gansel and Matt Plosiak, 2 brilliant consultants with decades of experience between them, take real questions from real small business owners and give them answers that help put them on the track to success. It's smart, funny, informative, and we promise it will help you make your company the best it can be. Listen and subscribe now to Mind Your Own Business with Mike and Matt at racecarradio.com. Race Car Radio is proud to support the work of Aya Worldwide, a tenacious and dedicated organization working to address the root causes of poverty in West Africa. Because they believe that who a person is and where they come from should not solely determine what they are able to achieve. To learn about their work and how you can support it, please visit ayaworldwide.org. And now back to London's New York. Now, you talked a little while ago about Lincoln Center as being, the building of Lincoln Center as being the sort of apotheosis of this big urban renewal of the period. And that was the seat of Bernstein's power, right? That was the throne on which he sat to disperse. But ironically, wasn't the neighborhood that they bulldozed to build Lincoln Center the very neighborhood that's being described in West Side Story?
Exactly. It's being described there, but it was also filmed there. That's the irony. So Lincoln Center's, the site of Lincoln Center, what used to be called San Juan Hill, was the filming location for West Side Story. So on the one hand, Bernstein is focusing on the social problems of the street. He's trying to depict the lived experience, the real pressing social issues of working class tenement house New York City, on the one hand. On the other hand, he is complicit in the destruction of that neighborhood by assuming the mantle of sort of the head of Lincoln Center, the head of the New York Philharmonic. And this is part of the irony of post-war liberalism, right? It's about acting in the interest of the working class and at the same time sort of destroying their communities beyond recognition. Whether that's inherent to this kind of liberalism, whether it was an oversight, that's up for debate. But it's an enormous irony that Bernstein is sort of ascendant upon the ruin of his own inspiration, let's say.
And maybe we could bridge from there to the one of the sort of defining negative moments of Bernstein's career, which is this, and maybe a great example of this kind of what people who are opposed to liberalism see as sort of liberal thoughtlessness of stepping into something without really looking where you're stepping. And maybe a good example of that is this famous dinner he gave for the Black Panthers.
So in 1970, Leonard Bernstein hosted the Black Panthers at his place in the Dakota Building, this very ritzy structure on the Upper West Side. And to his great misfortune, Tom Wolfe wrote a great expose on it from the New York Magazine. And you read the article, and there's a lot of very cringe-inducing moments. Let's assume that Wolfe was being accurate. There's these discussions between Bernstein and his wife about what color the servants should be. There's snickering at the outer borough officials who have come over to this party. There's discussions of the Black Panthers' fashion and how cool and natural their hair is. I mean, it's really gruesome stuff. And it basically invented the idea of radical chic, the idea of the liberal, the elite in Manhattan trying to slum it with the poor to get their political rocks off.
Could it have been an attempt to communicate?
I think it could have been an attempt to communicate. It could have been an honest liberal attempt to communicate. But what seems like an honest liberal attempt to communicate from one person could seem like the essence of snobbery to the other. And it did to Tom Wolfe and to many others.
It's a term, liberalism, that's fraught. And how do you define that term in this context? What does that mean to you?
Well, I think there's fundamentally many strands of liberalism. I think the muscular version that emerged in New York had its roots in the struggles of African Americans, many women, and many labor unions who saw the limits that a strictly, quote, neutral, hands-off state could provide them in the way of social support and access to real freedom. And it found its intellectual justifications in the writing of John Stuart Mill and especially John Dewey in the late 19th century. The idea that the primacy in politics should be individuals and that all politics should be ultimately down to the consent of individuals, but that individuals are social creatures. And according to this social liberalism vision that I'm talking about, freedom is not just freedom from coercion. Freedom is the ability to do certain things. And people who are poor, who can't afford housing, people who are at the mercy of their employers, are not as free as other people. And so freedom is also the ability to do something. And just as public housing or a social safety net, that gives people the ability or the opportunity to be more able to live their lives fully, let's say. And those have cultural implications too. And I think one of the things that discussing Bernstein brings up are the ways that liberalism can have these cultural outlets in the form of, let's say, conducting an orchestra piece or writing a piece of music. You can infer from those kind of musical pieces and their reception politics. Being exposed to and having the ability to encounter classical music or other forms of music or opinions or culture is doing something similar. It's giving you the opportunity to enrich your life.
If there's a criticism, when there's a criticism of liberalism, which there often is these days, I think maybe it comes from an idea that it's paternalistic, that in a way that, by saying, I'm going to save the world through my art and through my political movements. One, that the world is something broken and broken that needs to be fixed, and there are parts of the world that don't like that idea that there's something that's broken and needs to be fixed. And also that you, the person who is writing that piece of art, has the key by which you're going to fix it. Mm-hmm. And I think, I'm playing devil's advocate here because I consider myself a liberal and I admire the hell out of Leonard Bernstein, but I think he's also undoubtedly one of the great egomaniacs of the history of the world. And I think for a lot of people who don't like liberals, who don't like New Yorkers, who don't like, that's the reason, is they think we're full of ourselves and we know better than them and we're trying to tell them how to live their lives. And I'm wondering how you'd respond to that in relation to...
That's terrific. I mean, you look at like the NPR shows or the PBS 13 shows, Masterpiece Theater, and God knows, yes, it sounds like it's this complete talking down, let's say, or you don't get it, right? And... So what's the alternative? Do you say that, let's say, classical music is rarefied and not for everyone to get? Or do you communicate it in a way that's very didactic? This is art and you should like it. You should eat your vegetables. Well, I think for Bernstein, what made it okay or better in some ways, went at his best, let's say, is vulnerable joy that he was exposing to other people in the love of what he was doing. The idea that a good society should involve growth, and that growth can come through being exposed to new ideas, to other opinions, to other groups, and that growth doesn't just happen by people being left alone. It happens through education, through teaching. So Bernstein is the cultural representation of positive liberalism. Boom.
The way to not ever get in a situation where Tom Wolfe is calling you out for being culturally insensitive in the way you're hosting the Black Panthers is to never take a risk like trying to throw a dinner party for the Black Panthers. Like the way to avoid those things that look flat-footed and the failures is to not try new things and to not attempt personal growth. And maybe that's the answer, is that what's great about Bernstein was he was always trying something. He was always trying to push the envelope and trying to do something he hadn't done before and trying to get other people to do things that they had never done before.
Yeah. And if it's one person doing it, I think, then it becomes this sort of egocentric, I'm talking down to you, let's say. And Bernstein could do that, but it's about collective growth. So it means uplifting and empowering other groups to do the same thing back at you, It is a kind of optimism.
There's a place for us somewhere.
Yeah.
It does exist.
Yeah. And, I'll bring it. So to connect this to another person who I admire, Walt Whitman, right? Walt Whitman is this another great spirit of New York, one of my personal heroes, the barbaric yawp, I am everyone and everyone is me, a sort of Bernstein of the 19th century, let's say. And I have another favorite poet, Auden, who is this, or W.H. Auden, who's this English poet. And he once said of Whitman, no one should read him before the age of 24, sort of talking about how immature some of his hopes and dreams can be. And you need both. You need a kind of realism and maturity, and you need this kind of hope. And, I study political history. I know the granular, dry, wonky, as Weber calls it, the hollowing out of dry boards that politics involves, But I think the spirit that I'd like to inform this podcast with, and the sort of subject of a lot of our discussions to come, is going to be testing, exploring the relevance and the possibilities of this kind of optimistic vision of liberalism, which we've moved away from in the latter part of the 20th century, but that we're now perhaps hopefully moving back towards. So that could be Bernstein's legacy, transmitting those concerns and those values to a wide audience, and in some ways making institutions more responsive to them.
I believe that man's noblest endowment is his capacity to change. Armed with reason, he can see two sides and choose. He can be divinely wrong. I believe in man's right to be wrong. Out of this right, he has built, laboriously and lovingly, something we reverently call democracy. He has done it the hard way, and continues to do it the hard way, by reason, by choosing, by error and rectification, by the difficult, slow method in which the dignity of A is acknowledged by B without impairing the dignity of C. Man cannot have dignity without loving the dignity of his fellow. The way of dignity and divinity presupposes a belief in people and in their capacity to change, grow, communicate, and love.
My name is David Hoffman, and I produce this show. With me, as always, is Daniel London. New episodes of London's New York come out once every 2 weeks. Never miss one by subscribing to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and all your favorite podcast apps. We'd love to hear your feedback and ideas for future episodes. Interact with us on social media at LNY Podcast on Facebook and Twitter. London's New York is a production of Racecar Radio, www.racecarradio.com.